Thank you. Many of you have already met Jeff in formal and informal ways. It's my distinct honor to represent B&D Consulting today to introduce my friend and former colleague, Jeff Shuren. Jeff and I served together at the Department of HHS for several years, 2005 and on, and I came to appreciate Jeff's rich and varied skill set, his ability to manage a bureaucracy and think creatively. Jeff was originally trained as a physician. He focused in neurology. Ironically, he was also trained as a lawyer, and those are not always complementary skill sets. Jeff also served in the Bush administration and was entrusted with several very high-profile and critical projects, preparing the nation for avian flu, developing the Sentinel system, negotiating the user fee agreement, and working on the import safety project that the administration was working on. He subsequently stayed on and was entrusted by the Obama administration as CDRH Center Director. In the course of this time, he's demonstrated many wonderful qualities: intelligence, a delightful wry sense of humor. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce Jeff Shuren.
Thank you, Vince. I appreciate the kind words. I'm not sure my wife would agree with you, but thank you. Thank you, Governor Dayton. Thanks all of you for the opportunity to come speak today. In particular, I'd like to thank Dale Wallstrom and his team at LifeScience Alley, who really made this moment happen. I'll tell you, a few months ago, I was up here in Minneapolis. Dale was taking me back to the airport, and he turned to me in the car and he said, "Jeff, can we find opportunities for the medical device industry and the FDA to work together to build stronger bridges, but even more important, to make improvements in the medical device ecosystem and keep it healthy?" And I said to him, there are lots of things we can do, but there's one in particular that's in great need of our partnership, and that's something called regulatory science, a title I did not come up with, one that even gives me the hives when I hear the word regulatory, but believe it or not, something that is very important. So what actually is regulatory science? It is the tools and the approaches and the standards for assessing the safety, effectiveness, performance, and quality of medical products. But let me phrase it a different way. It's about, if you're going to fail, not only you fail fast, but it's also about how do we succeed faster. It's about how do we reduce the number of innovation cycles it takes from going from the first prototype to the commercial product. It's about how do we reduce the evidentiary needs to get to market. How do we have the preclinical tests that either minimize the need for or reduce or eliminate the need for clinical studies. And to us, this is a game changer. Let me give you some examples, because at CDRH, at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, we have a team of scientists who work in over 20 laboratories to further this science and feed this science into our pre-market review. For example, in Europe, they're working on something called the virtual physiological human. It is a set of computer models, but it is just normal anatomy. It's driven by academia. In the US, we are working on something called the virtual physiological patient. It is a set of computer models that we eventually actually team up with a database of imaging studies that is about application to the design of medical devices, to allow manufacturers to more quickly determine designs that are more likely to be successful, and to test drive them in a computer model more rapidly before having to go on to animal or human, and maybe actually reducing the need for some of the clinical studies. And here it's being driven by industry, the FDA, and academia. We've already worked with partners on creating a virtual family, a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl, kind of a macro level of anatomy that we use for assessing the impact of radio frequency on the body from different technologies, and this is available now for companies to use. But we're taking it to the next step, developing more detailed models about the body itself. We have projects already underway with collaborators on setting up the virtual human heart, the complete peripheral vasculature, the bone body, and the model mind. And this is just an example. These are 8 projects already underway with a variety of different manufacturers and universities, including the University of Minnesota, to actually develop models for the human circulatory system. And all this will be available for anyone in the industry to use. It is a public good that's being developed. Another example, and let me run through a few of them, all of them are being done in collaboration with manufacturers, academia, or both, or other parts of the government. So one of the areas we invest in is the development of phantoms. They're models of the human body that can be used as a surrogate for testing on a real human, the effects of an imaging study. So in this case, we developed a phantom of the thorax, and not only of normal anatomy, but also about nodules that replicate tumor in the lungs, as a tool that makers of CT scanners can then use as a way to develop their technology and not have to assess it on people or on fewer number of people to determine if that device is safe and effective. That saves time and that saves money, because ultimately this is about saving time, reducing cost for device development, assessment, and review. Another example is developing phantoms for optical coherence tomography, the ability to really drill down to look at the retina and the cornea. In fact, looking at the retinal arterial system, a methodology that ultimately may be a way to diagnose atherosclerosis earlier, in some cases maybe even more cheaply. This is being applied to other fields now, like dentistry. And here developing a phantom that mimics the retina, again, so you don't have to expose patients to radiation and can do the testing less costly. High-intensity focused ultrasound. It's a new technology that eventually may be in a place to replace some surgical procedures. The ability to cut tissue within the body without having to cut the skin, but creates challenges for how do you assess that technology. So we are working on partners with new test methods to more accurately determine the benefit-risk profile of these kinds of ultrasonic surgery. In some cases, we find devices that fail when they're out there on the market. We want to better understand those failures and feed that information back to companies, understand the root causes, and in fact have better ways to predict if there are failures and avoid them to begin with. No company wants to have that happen to their product on the market. It's costly, it's not good for them, it's not good for patients. So in this case, we're working with the VA on identifying the root causes for many of the failures we see in ICD leads, and then feed that information back to companies. We sometimes see failures with spinal fusion devices. And right now, many of the tests available are not all that great at predicting damage to the soft tissues around those devices and ultimately device failure due to problems with durability. So again, working with partners on new preclinical test methods to better assess the durability and likelihood of failure of particular designs for spinal fusion devices. Increasingly, we're seeing more patients being exposed to medical imaging studies that use radiation. More people in the population, and they're receiving more tests. So we and industry are interested in new technologies that can produce high-quality resolution films, but with lower radiation. So we've been working with industry on methods to better assess the trade-offs in different designs on quality of the image versus radiation exposure. On the in vitro diagnostic side, we're seeing technologies that are going to move testing from the laboratory to the point of care. Things like a lab on a chip. A lot of the technologies now are using fluorophores, that the results are communicated through fluorescence. But one of the problems is that many of these fluorophores are not stable. And so after a short time, what you may get is no fluorescence. And is that because of it's a negative result, or it's actually a false negative? What we're finding is in many cases it's a false negative because the material has degraded. So we are working with partners on developing more stable compounds that then anyone in industry can use to ultimately make a lab on a chip the standard of care in US healthcare. Nanomaterials are being used increasingly for their unique properties, but at the same time, standard toxicological test methods are not very good at assessing the safety of these nanomaterials. It leads to this scientific uncertainty, leads to delays in bringing important technologies to market. So we again are working on new test methods that more accurately describe the safety profiles and identify where the weaknesses are in design so we in fact can more readily develop the technologies that get to market that are truly safe and effective using nanomaterials. Increasingly, we are seeing failures for devices due to problems at the interface between the device and the user, the area of engineering called human factors or usability. And as devices become more complex and as they move increasingly to the home, we're seeing more and more problems in this area of human factors. So we recently established a laboratory, the Human Device Performance Laboratory, to make better assessments on human factors, come up with easier ways to do usability testing and make that available for companies. For example, we've developed a generic interface that allows for different kinds of inputs to be used and to then assess how different users interface with that interface and make that as a tool available to others, again, so that we can design better technologies and assess them more quickly and at lower cost. And last example I'll give is on the post-market side. We all know that if you do pre-market clinical studies, we're going to miss certain long-term outcomes, certain long-term risks, or certain rare events. You know, we all take that sort of risk ourselves. We're never going to know everything before a device hits the market. But at the same time, it takes a long period of time to have a full understanding of the benefit-risk profile of new technologies. And as a result, delays in where we may understand a risk so well that we can reduce the amount of data needed to get that device to market, or in fact down-classify that device, move it from class 3 to class 2 or class 2 to class 1, or be able to use data from the post-market setting in lieu of other data to support pre-market approval. That's where we want to be. But one of the critical steps is having the methods to assess post-market data and, if you will, be able to rely on data with lots of inherent biases to make these decisions. So we have set up the Medical Device Epidemiology Network, which is a collaboration with health professional organization, industry, and academia in developing these new methodologies for assessing post-market data and in particular disparate sources of data to make linkages between them and, if you will, make lemonade out of lemons. Now, the federal government spends a lot of money on bench science. The data I'm showing you here is from the National Science Foundation, and I'll apologize, it goes to 2008. We asked the National Science Foundation for the latest data, and they said, don't worry, you'll have it in early 2012. So not available for today. But what you'll see is the government spends a large portion of what goes into basic science. It puts in far less, though, when it comes to applied science. Still a fair bit of money, but a lot less. And when you get to health-related engineering, the federal government really doesn't spend a lot. Compared to other countries, we do pretty well. But as you can see, there are some countries that are spending more than us, and some that over time are going to outpace us, particularly China. They'll win the war on science. And that is troubling to us, because ultimately, that's where innovations are coming from. Europe, in fact, has partnered with the pharmaceutical industry to help identify and then develop safer, better medications. They've, in fact, invested 1 billion euros into this effort alone. But here in the US, just last year, the NIH's budget for research was a little over $30 billion, and that's predominantly for bench research and some applied, some translational. If you look at the FDA side, in fiscal year 2011, the amount of funding for device-related regulatory science was about $15 million. And that's for both the people and for maintaining the laboratories and investing in certain research. A very small investment. So where do we go from here? The answer isn't going to be the federal government. You know what the economy is like. The likelihood of seeing more dollars flow here is slim. Would be great, but it's going to be challenging in this economic environment. So any real investments are going to require government and industry to work together. What we really need to do is to establish a continuing, self-sustaining forum in which industry, the FDA, and academia jointly can work in the pre-competitive space to advance regulatory science. And here's the way we would see it working. And this model, by the way, exists in other areas. In fact, it exists on the drug side. It doesn't exist yet on the device side. And that's where we deal with an independent third party. You can consider it Switzerland, where you have rules of governance for deciding what we work on. And we jointly figure out where are the efforts to invest in. In fact, we would see industry as the lead, saying this is the area where we really, if we had new tools or we had better tools, we could truly reduce the time and cost for development and assessment. This would be a big deal to do. And then we're sharing our expertise, we're sharing our resources to fund those efforts. And then what the FDA brings to the table is we validate those tools. We give you the assurances that if you use this test method, the data generated will be accepted by us to support approval and clearance of your device. And all of that becomes available for any of the manufacturers to use. We're not talking about sharing technology. We're not talking about sharing your devices. We're talking about the ability to develop and share the tools used to assess those devices. And we think that effort alone can have a huge impact. The first step there is what you saw a moment ago. It was the MOU that we just signed with LifeScience Alley. To us, that is the first step in creating that public-private partnership. And at the end of the day, I'll leave you with this one message, that if we're going to remain as the leaders in medical device technology, it's not just about being the leaders in medical device innovation. We have to be the leaders in regulatory science. Because if we lead there, we're the ones who are in charge of making sure that the time and cost for developing the evidence to support the FDA, and I personally believe evidence that ultimately will get you for reimbursement, then we stay ahead of the curve of the rest of the world. And that, to me, is true success. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. And as I understand, open it up to take a few questions.